Well, Dr. Joe Lukens joins us in the studio, and it's lovely to have you in here. It's always good and exciting. I love being able to, I really need a couch, I think, sometimes when you come in to talk to me, but it's always very revealing and really gets your thoughts going.
You wouldn't reach all the buttons on the bench there, I don't think, Grant, if you had a couch. But great to be here with you and Rod this morning and with all the listeners.
Yeah, and we've got a couple of things that I wanted to talk about, but I wanted to talk to you. There was an article that we exchanged thoughts on a few weeks ago. Meg Lamming did an interview, a podcast interview, and in that interview she discussed and talked about the whole notion of where she got herself in a position of overtraining and under-eating. So training yourself without enough fuel in there, convincing yourself there was enough and not being able to go on with it. And I know that's something that you've seen in various sports, but I think it's more prevalent in women's sport.
We certainly see inherently that people have a sense as to what's going to be helpful for them in terms of preparing for performance, preparing their bodies and so forth. And an article such as hers is a good reminder of the importance of leaning into sports science, that there are so many professionals there that can provide good advice. And I think one of the really tricky terrains for athletes to navigate is understanding the piece around how do I prepare my body, what do I need in terms of fuel, because there's so much information out there. Like it's literally on your phone at the end of your fingertips, and not all of that advice is sound. So I think where athletes they need an individualised approach about their own bodies and what they need to do. And the challenges are that people can get advice from anywhere, and this is a good example of what can happen when we don't follow that advice.
Rodney, sometimes when we're coaches, we've got so many other things going on. It's sometimes easy just to give acknowledgement and say, yep, no, that's all right, going well, happy with your game, and not realise that there might be these underlying things. Is there something that you've experienced in the sport with athletes certainly worried about how they're looking and how they're preparing for games, and a whole range of pressures that are on young and old players?
Yeah, I think that's where your personal relationships with the players really come into it. If you notice something a little bit off with a player, you can pick it up a bit earlier. If you're not really getting to know people, if you don't really know who you're coaching, that sort of stuff just slips. It's really important. Something that I forget a lot is just making sure that the players are mentally and physically prepared. You think you just go into a training and just start doing drills and things like that, but if they're not physically ready, if they're not fueled enough for the session, then their brain's not going to be working. All the stuff that you're doing in drills is out the window if they're not mentally switched on, if they're not fueled with their bodies. Yeah, the stuff that Dr. Joe's talking about is so spot on, and it gets forgotten so quickly.
Joe, in men's sport, and certainly my sport of rugby league, I see it particularly with the young players who really need the guidance because they're generally working full time, and they're either turning up to a training early in the morning where they've climbed out of bed, they're becoming accustomed to early morning training and shooting straight to training, or they've been at work all day and they jump in the car and they head to training and they're onto the paddock, and no one ever examines what's your fluid intake been like, what's your food intake been like?
Yeah, and I think that's such an important point. And often I can remember times when I've spoken to players who, like you say, have had, that's exactly been their pattern. And then it's about the type of work they're doing as well. Because I can remember a young fellow that I worked with once who was installing air conditioning units into roofs in North Queensland. Pretty hot up there because the aircon obviously isn't working yet. And would say, I literally have not been to the bathroom all day. I've drunk 4 litres of water, but just haven't needed to because I'm so dehydrated. And the conversation I'm having with athletes all of the time is, I can teach you the sports psychology part of it. Like Rodney said, we can do the X's and O's, we can do the drills, but if you haven't done the 2 probably most important parts of preparation for being an athlete, then it will all go out the window, and those 2 things are rest and fuel. You need to sleep and you need to eat if you're going to set yourselves up. And that's for all of us that are on the show, and those of us that are listening. We all perform at our best when we're fueled and we're rested. And so before you even worry about doing the fancy stuff, you really want to get that low-hanging fruit, which is how that's often described. You want to pick those from the tree.
Is it a problem that you were saying before, you've got everything in your hand with a phone, that there's just so much information, but it's all so generic? You need that personalised. You're talking about the guy on the roof. You'd read on an app that you need 4 litres of water. That guy probably needs 12.
Yeah, exactly. And exactly to your point, where you have the luxury of sports professionals that are sitting with you, where you've got dietitians, where you've got strength and conditioning coaches, if you've got sports science at your fingertips, that's where you really want to go to when you can. And to be really selective around the information you're taking on board and looking for evidence-based models as well, because sometimes we like the shortcuts. So if someone's got something online and it looks shiny and glossy and it's going to make me an Olympic athlete in 3 weeks, then of course I'm going to want it, but is it really going to follow through? And in some instances, particularly when it comes to nutrition, there's some really dangerous options out there. So I always lean towards getting advice from the professionals and following an evidence-based model.
And even at a junior level, to identify somebody who's got a background in nutrition or a dietitian or a nutritionist, and even if you can get them to come along to your club to talk to players once every 2 months, once every month, something pre-season, I think is important to access those allied health professionals. And it might be a cost involved, but it's a minimal cost when you look at the importance of the bigger thing. And I think for parents to consider, most of us have got private health. If you've got that, you can access usually a dietitian for a couple of appointments and won't break the bank. For your own child, particularly an adolescent that's developing, that's starting to train a lot and not getting... And I suppose, Joe, for me, if somebody like Meg Lanning can be doing that and they don't know, that's the scarier part for me.
Absolutely, because you would think, wouldn't you? There's an assumption that gets made is that by the time you've got to the elite level, you've ticked all those boxes. But it's a constant, ongoing thing. And I've talked to athletes about the challenge is we've all got a lot going on. You just gave a typical example of what it looks like in rugby league when you're an emerging player coming through. So for all of us who've got very full days, then at the end of the day going, now what am I going to cook for dinner is a challenging thing for lots of it. And the fact that many of us will go, okay, I'll just go and quickly pick up some takeaway or something like that, that's completely understandable. So it all comes back to habits. Maybe you need to do a click and collect and grocery shop once a week and plan your meals and so forth, because even though that takes time to do it, the long-term costs of not looking after yourself, we see it time and time again. And I think the other element and the challenge for coaches, coming back to some of the things that Rod's been talking about, is that communication piece and how you speak with athletes. I guess for me in the psychology realm, the number of times I've crossed paths with an athlete who've had a passing comment made to them by a coach or by someone in the team that was possibly well-intentioned but didn't come across that way, and then all of a sudden I've got an eating disorder sitting in front of me or something like that.
You can so quickly turn to that.
Yeah. Absolutely, and that comes about for a range of reasons, so I'm not throwing that all onto the coaches, but if you have a vulnerable athlete, a passing comment, and literally I can think in my head of quite a number of cases where it's just, and I'm not going to say the comments online, but it'll be a passing comment, and then all of a sudden that was the final straw, because a coach is obviously a high status person in your life when you're an athlete, and you take those words on board. And so that's the thing. And for a coach who's on the fly too, with lots of things going on, they might make a comment about an athlete who needs to, maybe in basketball they need to get down the court faster. That's what you actually want them to do. But instead of delivering that message, a coach might make a comment to them about their weight or their health. And there's different ways to have that conversation. So I think what we ideally want to is to provide support to coaches to help them,
because we're not prepare them for that conversation and how they can approach it.
And coaches are there with their expertise in the sport, and of course they know elements of nutrition and psychology and strength and conditioning. The coaches that I've worked best with and are the ones who feel confident enough in themselves to say, hey, I'm not a dietitian, so I'll get a dietitian in to help with that. I'll get sports psych maybe to help with this. I'll get the strength and conditioning coach to help with this. So whilst I'll oversee it, and it ultimately comes down to the coach's decision, but the coach shouldn't have to wear the responsibility for all of that, and most coaches aren't qualified to. So why ideally a coach will lean into professionals that can help, because that will help the athletes and then that will help with performance.
Yeah, no, definitely. Look, we've got to move on topics, because I also wanted to touch on the head injuries, and it's going to be something that, Joe, we've talked about doing as a progressive thing and looking at it from different angles, because there is so much in the media about head injuries. It's impacting so many sports, not just the sports that we're familiar with. There's a lot of other sports where there's a lot of banging, pushing, bumping, thumping that can lead to injuries, aside from the catastrophic type ones that we saw the other day with the St George Illawarra player in a collision with one of the Roosters players, a head clash, and it happened. And yeah, so it's at every level, and there are concerns there, but it's also some of the minimal things. And I think we wanted to start today talking about parents and how parents are perhaps feeling quite challenged at the moment about, should I let my daughter or son play that particular sport? What are the risks? How does it go about it?
Yeah, and I would agree, and I certainly hear that concern expressed by parents when I cross paths with them in various sporting environments, because we very much know, if you look how far, again, this comes back to the science, doesn't it, where our knowledge is expanding all of the time, and what we're going to know in 3 years' time, in 5 years' time, is a long way from what we know now. I totally understand that concern that parents have around, is this sport going to be safe for my child? Are there things that we can put in place? There's always discussions around things such as headgear and all those sorts of things, all way out of my expertise, so I won't weigh into those. But what I would definitely acknowledge is the concern that parents have around what will be the long-term effects for my child playing in a particular sport, because of course we all want our kids to play sport because we want them to have fun and we want them to enjoy it and do things that they feel capable at.
And there are so many good things, and the examples we're seeing in senior level aren't necessarily linked to any of the junior stuff. There are so many good adjustments that most sports have made in a junior level to make it a safe environment and help nurture our young people through, so they can enjoy, can develop, can reach into all those positive things.
Yeah, and I think when we look at it from a community level, we want an active community. We want to be living in an environment where humans are moving, and sport is a great vessel for that to happen. And like you say, with all the modifications, and we've had modified sports for decades, I think, probably, when you look at the AFL and the basketball, and all the sports do it. So it is about putting those parameters in place too. And I think it's about parents asking questions, being mindful who you're asking the questions of, getting the information you can.
And how they ask the question. Not necessarily in an accusatory or something that might feel a little over the top, because a lot of the people involved in the junior sport are still getting knowledge together and understanding. So I think a lot of those conversations are going to be cooperative type conversations, where how can we collectively find out this information so everybody's well informed?
Absolutely. If I can share my favourite lead into a question, and then we might see what Rod thinks about this topic too, but my favourite lead into a question, particularly when I don't know, so it doesn't come across as accusatory, is to say, I'm curious about. I might go to Rod and say, hey, Rod, my junior athlete's coming through. He's keen for basketball. I'm curious about what basketball put in place to help, because it's contact sport and so forth. And I think that's something for all of us to remember. I'm reading a bit of research at the moment about curious, so it's a little bit of an interesting spot for me at the moment. When you say that you're curious about something, people want to lean in, then you get good conversations, you get good information, and I think that's an important place for us to all start.
I think, Rod, curious is something that as coaches we use far more now than we did back in the day. We were directional. Now there's this inviting this curiosity.
Yeah, and it's just like coaches are always searching for information. They're always looking, like even like this weekend, I'm going to watch the Blackhawks and their coaching staff just to get more information. Yeah, coaches are always searching for stuff, and even their coaches are trying to reach out more to parents now instead of the other way around. Coaches are reaching out to parents to find out more about the kids, to find out a little bit of background, and even that gets the conversation starting, just to have a line of communication with a parent instead of it just the parent feeling like it's always them going to the coaches. So, yeah, communication's a big thing. But, yeah, anytime a coach gets asked about, like, I'm just curious about this, they love passing on information. They love trying to share stuff about sport because, let's face it, like 99% of coaches are in it as a volunteer, but they're doing it because they love the sport. They're doing it because they love the game. So anytime you get a chance to pass on some information, yeah, coaches lap it up.
Yeah, no, I think it's really important. Look, we've got to wrap the topic up today, but thanks so much for coming in, Joe.
Always good to be in. Thanks for the invitation.
And we will talk more about that over coming weeks and include some conversations with people at different levels in different sports.
Sounds great.
And get their thoughts on it. And I also want to talk to you a little bit about tribalism and the importance of tribalism in sport, with discussions that Balmain might lose their own heart of Leichhardt Oval, and it's been talked that it may become a ground that's not used again, very similar to South Sydney losing Redfern Oval and the identity around Redfern Oval. And they managed to move elsewhere in around the Coogee area, but they've got a magnificent new facility there, but it's what pulls at the heartstring, the tribalism. So we'll look forward to chatting as well about that, Joe.
That'll be a great chat. We might need to set aside some time for that one.
I think that'll be a one
I might need to
show.
shut the whole show for that one. That's a great topic.